Today we have a great panel to talk about this idea of what we mean by knowledge creation and how data protection actually does an excellent foundation for creating an enterprise data strategy while managing risk. So I'm the COO at the Information Accountability Foundation, along with senior strategist. Prior to that, I've been a chief privacy officer 3 times at a data science company, at Intuit, and at Hewlett-Packard. Joanne Stonier will be joining us today. She is the Chief Data Officer from MasterCard. She's a global data expert with expertise in strategy and has substantial experience in creating data strategy and management programs, ensuring data innovation while navigating data risks. She's a leading expert on data ethics and responsible data practices with the focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence. Prior to this role, she was the Chief Information Governance and Privacy Officer and Chief Privacy Officer for MasterCard. And prior to that, was the Chief Privacy Officer at American Express Company. Also joining us is Marty Abrams. Marty is the Executive Director at the Information Accountability Foundation. Marty's got over 35 years experience in information and consumer policy. In founding the Information Accountability Foundation. This was really built on the work of the Global Accountability Dialogue, a multi-stakeholder process that defined the essential elements of accountability that we see woven throughout many global data protection regulations around the globe. Marty's previous experience includes head of information policy at Experian, which was originally TRW Data Services, and started his career with the Federal Reserve. And he is by education and training an anthropologist. So with that, let's jump in. We have some slides to highlight our talk for today. So if we could go ahead and get those loaded up, that would be awesome. So while we're waiting for the slides, let me give you a perspective on what we'll be talking about. And what we wanted to do was set the stage, first of all, and talk about what we mean by this idea of knowledge creation and knowledge application. And when we talk about this idea of knowledge creation, we're really focused on what it means to do research in a commercial or a corporate setting, different from research institutes, scientific research typically conducted in academia or in other worlds. An easy way to think about that is the idea of thinking with data. And one of the things that's important to know about this when we think about it in the data protection context is that very often data protection and privacy laws actually don't specifically address this idea in an effective or practical way of what we mean by knowledge creation. So if we could go ahead, we are on slide 3. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. We wanted to highlight that typically this commercial research isn't usually called out as an explicit legal basis or legitimate interest for data processing. And while scientific research definitely has some support in the law, there's very different interpretations of how far that goes, but tends to resolve down to a pretty narrow interpretation of what happens in an academic or a university setting conducted by very specific individuals and overseen by some type of review board process. So if we move to the next slide, what we want to do is then connect the two and talk about, well, if knowledge creation is about thinking with data or discovering insights in a commercial or corporate setting, knowledge application is the next step. Often they're conflated, but if you think about thinking with data and acting with data, an example would be simple scoring, and it doesn't necessarily mean credit scoring, but the idea of developing a score is thinking with data, applying that or using that score, whether it's a group or down to a very small section, that's the acting with data. So we're right there. Great. The risk for these two activities is different, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in particular, where we see friction, and Marty especially is going to dive into this, is policymakers and implementers are not always clear on what the difference is. And a lot of the angst, a lot of the discussions and debate we see are about the acting with the data more than the thinking with data. So at this time, what I'd like to do is we're going to move to the next slide and have Joanne talk about how she's developed a data strategy that has data protection and data ethics at its core. So Joanne, turning it over to you.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to see both of you. And hello to all my privacy friends out there. I've missed seeing many of you during COVID time. Sure. So, as we think about these two intertwined issues of knowledge creation and knowledge application, right? They're two different things, but they are intertwined, and they do have to do with how do we think with data? How do we create value with data? And then when you think about it, the regulations do not come at these issues head on. And yet most organizations have been really very busy with these activities over time as they innovate. And yet no regulation really addresses it simply. And organizations are pretty much left on their own to try to figure out, well, what is ethical or responsible data innovation? And so many organizations over time, and certainly with the advent of the GDPR, we're left to try to figure out, well, what does that look like from a practical application perspective? And how do we do that? So at MasterCard, we came up, and I've talked quite a lot about data governance and our responsible data responsibility principles, which are really the backbone of our program at MasterCard. And from there, we develop our practices, our principles, our guidelines, and then ultimately our practices and controls in how we do product development. And then in that product development process, how do we apply those as we actually build out products and solutions? And so when you think about governance, right, governance is always kind of, and sometimes it's embraced as a good word, but many times people react to it in the product development world as a bad word, right? It's going to be something that's going to slow down innovation. And instead, how we try to think about it, it's part of the design process, right? So when we started to think about, well, what are the responsible data practices as opposed to just privacy or just as opposed to security, what are the data practices that we need to teach our organization? And really it also came down to, well, what are you trying to effectuate at the very end? And so we designed everything. And if you had to look at this slide in a MasterCard setting, the very center of all of this would be the individual, right? Who you're going to design for, because almost everything that you do in an organization, even in a company like mine, where really a B2B2C company is going to be individually impactful. So when we started with the realization, and really the very first were our individual principles, which were that data belongs to people, right? So individuals own their data. Individuals should have the ability to control their data. Well, okay, all of the privacy people are going, yeah. And then individuals should have the ability to understand how their data is being used. And then they should also understand, and this one was really the interesting one, the benefits that they get from that data use. And that's where I think it sometimes comes off the rails a little bit, because I don't know that all of us are transparent enough, that we're clear enough in how we're using the data. And that's the harder one, right? I mean, we can try to have privacy notices. I'm not going to talk about that. We can try to do real-time privacy notices, but that doesn't always work. So how do you incorporate that into a product design that's based on data so individuals can really understand that? So once my organization came up with those 4 kind of guiding stars, I looked at everybody was so proud of themselves. I said, well, that's all very nice, guys, but they're going to turn around and say, well, that's nice, MasterCard, but what are you doing about it? And that's where our principles came out, which were really about, okay, privacy and security. And we were known for that. I mean, we're an organization that has to provide security, and we have to certainly do privacy well. But then when you get beyond that, what are we talking about? And it was really about being accountable for how we're going to use the data and be willing to talk about it and be transparent in what we're doing with the data. So those were the next 2 principles. Again, building on a lot of Marty's good work and the work of SIPL. And then it was really, okay, we also have to talk about that we're going to have integrity as we're using new tools and techniques. And that's when you get to things like AI and machine learning, and the integrity in the process of data quality, data lineage, accuracy, completeness, consistency in data. And then also talking about that you also innovate with data, and that data isn't static. And what are those innovation practices? And then getting to the research point where we started, data for social impact, right? For positive social change. And this was before COVID. And little did I know that that principle was going to really be important as we entered into COVID time. And then also as we move forward, making sure that you have inclusive data sets, which we really learned as we've been through COVID. And all of those principles really, really make a difference as you build practices for each different type of data set and each different context in which you use data. All of that goes through expertise and training, through your tools, your platforms, all the way through to our sales force. And so I was curious with the poll, everybody answered kind of everyone, which is true, but who's your champion of this? Who drives it through your organization? I think is a different question. So I'll stop there. But that's kind of how we began our data strategy and our responsible data strategy that really changed how we do product design with really the individuals at the core.
If we could move to the next slide, and Joanne, I think you touched on some of the elements there, but
so you really have to link all these things, right?
Yes,
I mean, so
yes.
that's really the secret sauce. And how do you do that so that it's the language of everybody? It's the language of the product team, so that when they're coming up with the idea, they know how to apply the principles. And that, yes, you have the privacy team there. Yes, you have the security team there. My team is there to do all the things I talked about around data quality, the right data fit for purpose. Are we sourcing the right information? Is it really the right thing to do? What are the impacts of the product on an individual? And also, when I say data domain or context, are we talking about fraud? Are we talking about a marketing product? Are we talking about a loyalty product? What are we doing with the data? It really, the risks are very, very different. And then what tools are you using, right? If you're using AI or machine learning, well, that's a very different inquiry than if you're just using a simple algorithm, right? It's very, very different in how the methodologies are that you're using. And that makes a difference in how you're applying all of this. Mm-hmm. And then really getting it, once you're past the product development stage and proof of concept, making sure your system analysts, your developers also understand it as you're creating this on a platform. And then who's using that platform? And we got this all the way through into our sales training. And our sales teams understand these risks as they work with our customers. Because many times at MasterCard, our products and solutions, down to this notion of applying things, they're the ones who are actually loading it into their systems, using it with their data. And so they have to understand when they're selling something, what's the additional risks or the additional issues that have to be solved by the customers themselves. So all of this, it really does take a village to understand all of the interrelationships when you're using data to navigate this, to really understand what are the implications to the end individual who's going to be impacted by the product or solution.
So if we could move to the next page, and Joanne, actually, I think just back one, folks. There we go. So one of the things I wanted to ask you real quickly, which you've described, is it sounds like privacy functions, governance functions, other data functions are all working together in a collaborative approach. Mm-hmm. What are some best practices around that to really build that collaborative approach? Because those organizations don't always work together real closely.
Well, first of all, I think you have to stop making privacy just about compliance. And I think you have to stop making security just about the technology. I think we have a process that we call our studio process, where we're all engaged in the innovation, right? Because we all innovate together. And so depending upon what we're trying to solve for, all of us have a role in the innovation. And we do it early, and we do it often, and we do it in an iterative fashion. And so we're all at the table designing together. And that makes a huge difference, because then everybody's part of a design team. You have different subject matter expertise that you bring to the table, but that makes a huge difference in how do you get to the right outcomes. Everybody has the right to ask the question. And that makes a very even playing field rather than a series of gates that a product or solution has to go through.
Thanks, Joanne. Now we're going to switch to Marty, and what Marty's going to do is set the stage for us to talk about some of the polarization and the balancing that is or isn't happening around knowledge creation, data innovation, and data protection. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
So
Great.
before we build through the next couple of slides, I'd actually like to link some of the research done over the last 10 years with what Joanne just talked about and demonstrated. So there was a process that took place that began in 2009 with the development of essential elements of accountability and organizations beginning to embrace the essential elements of accountability and them being embraced by regulators based on active discussion back and forth, including people like Joanne Stonier in that process of developing the concept of accountability. And then we reached the point where you had to say the uses of data that are not explicitly understood by individuals, but are essential for an innovative marketplace that uses data is this concept of knowledge creation or thinking with data. So a process took place between 2012 and 2016, where this concept of thinking with data and acting with data was explicitly articulated. The Information Accountability Foundation does research and education with policymakers and regulators. And the policymakers and regulators needed a sense that there was something that was beneficial to society and people that organizations do that supports this concept of doing big data, that supports the early concept work in artificial intelligence, and this concept of that you could separate the risks that come with thinking with data, the fact that you have to have the data secure, you have to understand the data, there's bias related to data. All of those things were very different than the activities related to actually applying the data. So if you think about the way the regulations are structured, you see the GDPR has a reference in Article 5 to research always being a compatible purpose. Well, is what organizations do with data, that research that is always a compatible purpose, versus all of the issues that come into automated decision making, using data to make decisions that are explicitly about people. Should they get a benefit? Should they have their interest rate reduced? Should they have available healthcare? All of the questions that all the decisions that are made that have to be directly controllable. I am truly sorry about that. And I thought I turned my phone off. I apologize. So there was this process to differentiate thinking with data and the risks of actually developing something that are not personally impactful with the risks of making a decision which are personally impactful. And there was a regulatory and policy discussion that went on for numerous years. And that discussion sort of created some level of comfort with this concept of thinking with data. Since 2018, for lots and lots of reasons, what we've seen is a polarization in the way people think about data that is similar to the polarization that we're seeing in other venues as well. And this creates risks for your organization's ability to develop and use data for product development, for marketing, for making products safer, for data security. All of these elements are based on this concept of thinking with data, and there's new polarization around that. And we're beginning to see that polarization in things like the Federal Trade Commission's focus now on surveillance economy, the observational stuff that leads to disparate treatment, and blaming that on the research rather than the application of that data. I was involved in the discussion today with a European official where we talked about this concept of thinking with data and acting with data. And this official said, in Europe, I own my data. I have a COVID test, I own the data, and I feel comfortable with that. In the United States, I don't own the data because you don't have a comprehensive privacy law. And how can I have this discussion about the ability to think with data in a safe fashion when I no longer own my data? And it's this concept by a policymaker today in a polarized way, which was not the environment we had in 2016 when we really developed these concepts. And that's a major change, and that change has impact. So when you think about it, back in 2016, we would think about the concept of what is the individual's place in this environment. And it was about a question of knowledge and autonomy. It was transparency and the ability to understand the decisions individuals were making. And at that point, you could find a fairly easy balance with knowledge creation based on the concept of sound and trustworthy path forward. So in other words, all the things that Joanne was talking about were this path forward. Today, we see regulators who say folks don't know how to do legitimate interest balancing, that we won't trust the private sector to do research. It's not the same thing as scientific research. You have to have a complete explicit consent in order to think with data. And it's about the concept of individual sovereignty that is different from the concepts of autonomy in that it goes to the fact that I have an ownership right around the data that pertains to me, no matter how that's gathered. On the flip side, there is a sense by some organizations that helps cause this friction that the market will the market will self-correct, that regulation needs to be a soft touch, that we can depend on that soft touch to fix things, and that there's a sense that the information observational economy will self-fix. And when you have that polarized, it makes this concept of a sound and trustworthy path forward hard. Could you please bring up the next slide? And please bring up, click one more time.
There we go.
All right. So if you'll notice, if in a polarized world, if you're putting incredible weight on this concept of individual sovereignty, based on the perception that data extraction, which is a word that is being used by the Federal Trade Commission, it's being used by the civil society in Europe. It's a term that is reflective of the theories of Shoshana Zuboff. If you take that perception to its ultimate conclusion, that the weight around individual sovereignty becomes much stronger, and you have to shift sort of the concept of what is sound and trustworthy processing over to the side to make that balancing work. In other words, that the weight around individual sovereignty is just the dominant weight and leads to a regulatory concept that is more restrictive in the way we think about the use of data. And it's that concept of individual sovereignty that was discussed yesterday on the Wire Wheel conference by Jessica Rich in terms of the FTC views on what is an extraction economy and how that should be regulated and how that should go into fairness, or the thoughts being put forward by None of Your Business in Europe, and the reflection in work by, for example, the ICO on digital marketing. This is a reflection of this concept that individuals are losing sovereignty over their data. They should have sovereignty over their data, and that we should counterbalance to take that into account. Please change the slide. And please change it one more.
There we go.
So if you're a person in the European community who's responsible for digital innovation and pushing forward a digital agenda and the pieces of that digital agenda, or if you're in the Canadian government, and again, you're trying to push artificial intelligence as the new growth factor in that economy, or you're in Hong Kong and you're looking to compete with Singapore and you're trying to create an innovative space for that, then you begin to say that knowledge creation and data innovation is much more important. You look at the AI regulation, and the AI regulation in Europe is a softer touch piece of regulation that is then in competition with the concepts being put forth by the European Data Protection Board, which are becoming more and more restrictive in the way they look at things, and the whole shifting of the trustworthy path forward begins to shift. You really want that balance beam to be in the center. Please change the slide again. And so if you're thinking about this whole question of what does it mean to do what Joanne Stonier is doing, you have to think about it in terms of step. And the first is that every organization has to engage in responsible knowledge creation. There is no way an organization can be successful today if they're not using data to improve their products, to serve consumers better, to create new societal value, to solve things like new vaccines for the COVID-19 virus. All of these things are based on the concept of private sector knowledge creation. And we're in an environment right now where regulators are increasingly thinking that research is done in scientific institutions, when the fact is that most of the research is being done by organizations like Joanne's at MasterCard. That's where the research is being done. So if you have reticence risk in your organization and say, no, you can't use data for your own internal research, your organization will not be successful, and it will have impact on how you're seen within your organization as a privacy person. Is that not true, Joanne?
Well, it goes beyond that, Marty, right? So as a privacy person, and we work super close with our privacy team. So first, let me say that. Let me give a big shout out to the MasterCard privacy team. But it goes beyond what you need to do within the confines of your own organization. All of the best innovation requires partnering with other organizations. And so you're going to be you're going to be behind the 8 ball, even if you are the best at innovating in your own industry. The best innovation requires partnering with other organizations. And so how do you have a way forward to do that data partnership? And let's face it, data ecosystems are here to stay. The only way we will come up with the best innovations is through data partnerships and through methodologies where you can do trusted data sharing. Well, responsible data sharing and data practices, right? And to create kind of the knowledge that Marty's talking about and the knowledge that I'm talking about, and Barb started us off with, requires responsible practices. And it does not mean sharing raw data. And it does not mean sharing raw, personal data or sensitive data. It means coming up with the practices that are responsible, that are accountable, that are transparent, that are innovative, and that have a lot of integrity in their methodologies that enable innovation to happen. But it means it takes a village. It means it takes me saying, well, can we try this? Can we have a sandbox? And what information are we going to use? Can we use privacy enhancing technology? Can we use synthetic data sets? And how will we develop those synthetic data sets? How can we use different security methodologies? How can we use keys? Right? There's all sorts of methods that should be explored and do meet the spirit of the regulation. But regulators don't understand the practice, but they will understand your principles. And then they will understand from the principles your practice. If you begin to break down, again, principles to practice, to an overarching governance, to then an initiative in context. But if you don't do it that way, nobody's going to understand it.
Let's flip to the next point, because that's exactly what it's going to say. To be trusted, organizations have to be responsible and answerable. So we all have talked about accountability nonstop since 2009. There is a rough adoption of accountability in the GDPR. It's explicitly part of almost every law that's passed since the GDPR. And the best definition of accountable is that organizations need to be responsible. In other words, understand what they're doing and the impact on all the stakeholders that are impacted by that use of data, including research. And then they have to be answerable to that. But even more today, they have to be proactive in being able to demonstrate their accountability. So the fact is that when regulators are thinking about organizations' use of the data around knowledge creation, they're not focused on the players that do this in an excellent way. they're focused on the folks who've screwed up. And in every environment there's going to be a screw up. So the fact is that organizations have to stand ready to demonstrate their accountability in a very proactive manner. If you look at Joanne's principles, it goes to this concept of we stand ready to demonstrate what we're doing, how we're going to do it. And then if a regulator came in calling, she would be able to do it. Can we go to the next bullet point, please? So at the IAF, we have been developing assessments to demonstrate that knowledge creation is done in a responsible way, almost in a nonstop manner since 2016. We have done a process in the United States with Axiom that they use in terms of their knowledge creation process. We did a process with the regulator in Hong Kong and industry to develop an assessment process around ethical data use there. We did the same thing in Canada. We've developed an enhanced legitimate interest model that's all about this fact that you need to understand the risk you are creating for others when you're going to innovate with that, and the risk assessment process and the mitigations is built into the data governance. And it has to enable what Joanne was talking about. It's beneficial uses of data. If you're not using data in a way that creates value for others, only for the organization, that will not be seen by regulators or by policymakers as a good trade-off.
That's right.
And we see that lack of trust in many of the application, in many of the discussions that took place around COVID, of the COVID virus, monitoring of employees. All of that came into play in the saying, I don't actually trust organizations. We're going to put in really hard, tough controls that are hard to implement. And it takes us to the last point. And I think that this is also important. The world of knowledge creation, and there's beginning to be an acknowledgement of this, and probably most in the consultation that was recently done by the UK government, that if we're asking organizations to be innovative with data, and we're asking the public to trust that innovation, we have to have enforcement agencies that go beyond enforcement to be effective oversight agencies, which require a different set of skills to be able to determine whether people like Joanne are being honest when they say they have integrity in their process. And I'm not judging whether you do, Joanne.
That's
And
okay.
that they have the competency to execute on those processes. So the fact is that trustworthy, effective enforcement agency needs to have the capacity to understand that when you define what it means to be responsible in your knowledge creation, they can make a judgment on whether you're being effective in doing that. That's very similar to the way risk analysis is done in the financial services industry for the last half century. It's a different type of enforcement process than we see today. And Joanne,
just on that last point though too, we have a saying that trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. And so your practices, right? You're going to build them slowly over time. But it only takes one bad event. We know this, right? From breaches and other events for loss of consumer trust. And then you have to build it back again. But when you have the practices that you can stand up and say, no, that's not what happened, or this is how we do things, it makes a huge amount of difference in working with partners, working with customers of all types. For us, that's our banks, it's with merchants, it's with governments around the world. Especially as we expand our services and as all organizations expand their data footprint, right? And so this matters. It really matters how you go about thinking about how do you want to innovate with data. And even if you're just using data for most of your internal processes, right? As what we call as chief data officers for defensive uses. But if your organization is using it for what we're talking about today are offensive uses to create new products, new solutions, knowledge creation, then you want all of this in your line of sight as a privacy professional And you want to really be working with whoever is in charge of data innovation at your firm. You may not have a chief data officer, but you certainly want to work with whoever that individual or group of individuals is that's charged with that mandate.
Joanne, I want to actually build on what you were just saying and go back to something that you highlighted. And I think what's helpful is we so often talk about compliance and controls in this very structured approach. But what you also described is starting with principles and then going to policies and practices and then controls. And in the previous session, we heard a lot about assessments and controls and in a very structured way. But how would you describe how taking from a very broad level of principles, it can be very unifying, particularly across different functions in an organization, and how that ties then to kind of the mechanics of controls?
Look, there's always going to be controls. I'm not saying there shouldn't be baseline controls, right? Like one control we have is we do not share raw transaction data with unrelated third parties, right? Now, our banks give us data and our merchants give us data and they get their own data back, right? So let me be clear about that. But we don't give it to anybody else, right? So that's a baseline control that we have as sacrosanct. But beyond those baseline controls, if you're in a constant control environment, you can't have innovation. I mean, Marty's slide shows, right? You can't have it all one way or the other. So principles allow you the middle of the seesaw, if you will, right? Principles allow you to understand what's in bounds reasonably for the innovation conversation. And innovation is what most organizations are trying to do, because let's face it, we're talking about commercial organizations and they are in business to, satisfy their shareholders. So they must create value. Well, to do that, the principles allow you to know what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, right? So if you know that, and again, I go back to design principles because I think it's easiest for people to understand that, right? If you're designing in your home, if you're putting in a new kitchen, you know where the plumbing is, right? You know where the electric current is. It means you can possibly change it, but that's a lot of effort, right? It's a lot more expensive. It may be possible to go out of bounds, but it's really challenging and really difficult. Most people will design within a footprint, right? It's the same idea with principles. It doesn't mean that there's not controls even within those principles, but it means it gives you a place to start. And it means you don't have to keep going back to check with every last subject matter expert. Plus, if they're part of the design conversation, they get better at being creative with their controls and they get to move with the innovation, which, let's face it, also is happening, right? And that's what we're seeing with regulation. Regulators want to move with the innovation. That's why we're seeing the AI regulation. That doesn't mean they understand all of it. That's one of the issues we have. Law lags innovation, right? It always will. All right. I'm a lawyer. I get it. But we have to have a way that it goes fast enough, right, to actually keep pace with the changes we have in society. And so I think that's a way to think about it.
So
Joanne, I was going to ask Marty if you would build on that, and then actually, if the two of you would then talk about, and you touched on AI, and I know that's part of your expertise and purview, is then how does that relate to ethical AI principles, including the development of models? But Marty, I know you wanted to comment the other, but I wanted to get you to start thinking about that next question as well.
So to me, the most important principle is to really know what you're doing. When you start using data, know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that needs to be very disciplined. So you need to know who is going to be impacted by the processing. In AI, you don't know what the actual answer is going to be, but you know the question that you're trying to answer. And you're trying to start with the session of, is it a legitimate question? So the first part of ethical AI is what I'm trying to do with data. Is it legitimate? Is it something that is beneficial to the stakeholders who are impacted? So that's the first piece. And that's not something that you just, I think it's really requires the discipline to ask the question and actually frickin' write down who is impacted and how they're impacted. The second piece to that is, in this world of knowledge creation, it's not a bilateral relationship. It's not the organization and the data subject. It's the organization, the data subject, and all the other people who are going to be impacted by the knowledge that comes from that process. So it's not this simple proportionality process that we have talked about for a generation. It's a more complicated, more multilateral process that's about responsible and what is seen as responsible by others. So that's the second piece, is you can't think about it as data subjects and organizations. It's about all of the stakeholders that are impacted. And the third is that you really need to be able to describe what you're doing, why you're doing it, the risks of doing it, who's going to benefit from it, and the proof points that you actually understand what you're doing. And that's what gets you into AI. So AI, folks have argued that this concept of since AI is more open-ended than is traditional statistical research, but it still starts with the question of a legitimate question, and it ends with, am I getting the outcomes that are responsible on the back end?
All right, so I'm going to riff on this a little bit. So absolutely agree that you need to know what are you doing and why, right? And what are the impacts, and what are the potential impacts on the individuals of what you are trying to solve for? So in different contexts are going to be super important, right? I was on having a conversation with a health organization, and the person that was speaking said, we have to understand that lives are on the line in what we are doing. And that's super important, right? That means the risk of what they're applying AI for is you can't place a value on a life, right? So they have to be really, really careful what they're doing. At MasterCard, we use AI for fraud. We use AI for credit, to assist our banks with credit decisioning. We use AI for things that just natural language processing as we do some legal analysis to screen candidates, right? For lots of different things, for some of our other HR processes. But what we do is we actually have a very robust process, because where AI and machine learning is different than just other big data analytics is this. We used to say, if this condition exists in the data, do this. That's what traditional analytics do. AI does the opposite. It flips it on the head and says, look at all this data and tell us the conditions. And then we go forward. And the problem is that the data sets have not been pre-screened for suitability. They haven't been pre-screened for anything, right? And unless you know the quality of the information that you're using is good for the purpose for what you're trying to solve for, you can come up with the strangest answers that are not actually true. It's just what the data is telling you. So I use the example all the time. If you're using the voter rolls from 1910 in the United States, that may be great to find out a lot about what was happening in 1910, but it's going to miss women and people of color in the answer if that's the data set you use. So you have to understand the data that you're using. You have to understand the question, meaning the algorithmic inquiry you're making of the data set, and then the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And you have to look at those over and over again. So this requires professionals who are data quality experts, data sourcing experts, as well as algorithmists who understand that the way they ask the question can make a huge difference. There can be bias in how the question's been worded, how the algorithm's been created, that's unintended. Once you're satisfied you have all of that right, only then can you figure out, once you put all those pieces together, are you actually solving for what you set out to solve? And then you have to look at drift and whether you have even the right information to get to the question you were originally solving. And then even then, are you hitting the outcome you want? And is it a positive outcome for the individuals you may impact or not? And then if it's going to continue, meaning it's part of a chain of inquiry, what do you have to inform for the next parties or in the chain that are going to apply it to another data set that may yet veer it even further. So responsible and ethical AI processes, and right, privacy issues mean it's individually impactful, right? Means you really have to have a team understanding all of these issues. Everything Marty said is true, but regulators, are trying to regulate this, but professionals have to understand all of this because we're at the generation of AI right now where we have the opportunity to intervene. But once AI is really kind of placed into the wild, it will learn what we have taught it from the data it's going to absorb, and we have to be very careful how we're deploying it.
So in simple terms, if we've taught it to be prejudiced, it will be really good at being prejudiced.
Absolutely, be really good at it, and it will replicate that, and it will learn. It will continue down that veered path.
Yep.
And
so
and
let me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So
from a regulator's perspective, what they're thinking right now, and the precautionary principle in Europe accentuates this, is bad AI is bad for people, and we've got to prevent AI to prevent the bad AI, and that's part of the polarization that's come into play.
Well, and so what Marty, you actually led into what is essentially our wrap-up question. Is one of the things that we're seeing is that privacy and data protection, like regulations, proposals, and rules, are coming from the AI world rather than from the data protection world in many ways, at least some of the more innovative ideas, to the point you just made. And so really for both of you is how do national level AI strategies that focus on opportunity and growth, how do they balance, work with, support data protection? Are those in concert or in conflict? And does the public policy approach, whether it's in the US, in Europe, Canada, or elsewhere, does that need to change? And maybe Joanne, you go first, and then Marty, and then I think we're probably ready to wrap up.
Marty, why don't you go first? I want to hear your answer, and then I'll go.
That's very nice of you, Joanne. So there's a couple of things. One, regulators have to be in a position of asking the question, do you have the processes in place to do ethical AI, and you have the competency to do it, and are you going to do it in integrity? And they need to work out an oversight process that goes to this question of, do you have the processes in place, and are they done? Are they competently done, and are they done with integrity? There are, in terms of fair outcomes, the question of whether a form of discrimination is prohibited or is supportive of a better market, like the right chemotherapy for the right underlying conditions. Those fairness concepts, what is fair within a society, is actually grounds for other regulators or other laws. So we have to be able to differentiate from the process of saying you have a sound process and you can demonstrate the sound process, from determining what are the fair outcomes and who are the fair outcomes. For example,
absolutely go away.
Beg your pardon?
Okay. So for me, I think, so I agree with you. I think from our perspective that we really need, we need regulators to understand what good practice looks like, and how we can actually demonstrate, right? No matter what the context of the AI is, what are the steps that responsible organizations are going through, and how can we even that playing field so that they are similar no matter what the context is? And I think that's really important, so that we're using data that's inclusive, that's of good quality, that's consistent and fit for the purpose for what you're trying to solve for. I think that number one is really important. And I'm not sure that's well understood yet, because the concept of fairness, right, I think goes to, again, this misunderstanding of what bias is in the data, right? We talk about bias and it comes up in outcomes for sure. But I think there's bias in the data, there's bias in the algorithms, which then comes up with a biased result. But what have you done to minimize that? Right. And then what is the impact in what you're solving for have relation to each other. And that's when we get to, do you have a good process that has really been minimized the mathematical and data biases to then come up with a good outcome? And again, what are those steps you have to take in order to get there? And I'm not sure we're yet at that even playing field. And only then can we talk about fairness in comparing different when different organizations are trying to solve the same thing, right? Then you can get to, is this fair? Is this ethical within the same context? But I think we have a ways to go there. And I think regulators need to understand that. That's why I really do believe in these principles, these practices, and then can you begin to put them into an even sort of methodology so regulators then can truly regulate. And we, as commercial enterprises and industry, can continuously improve, because I'm also all about that.
So there's fair process.
Yes.
And then there's fair outcomes.
Exactly.
Both of them are important,
exactly.
but you oversee them differently.
Yes. Yes. Well put. Well said.
Are there any questions from the audience? I'm not seeing any, but there may be some that I'm not seeing.
Well, Joanne, I want to, I know you have a tough schedule today. I really want to thank you for joining us. This has been so much fun.
It has been fun. It's been great. It's been great to see both of you.
Okay, so I think that is it for our session today. We want to thank Justin and Camille and the whole team at Wirewheel for the opportunity to talk about this. And this is an ongoing discussion and debate, and we welcome inquiries and topics on that. Joanne, thank you for your time. Marty, thank you very much for your time and thoughts on this as well. And it looks like I think we're ready to close out today.